In early September 1944, the Barents Sea looked like a sheet of cold rolling metal. A German U-boat took a direct hit from depth charges in the dark steel twisted, bulkheads split, and icy water knifed in through the cracks. The familiar mix of diesel, sweat, and machine oil vanished in a rush of seawater and cordite. Willy Kranz hit the bulkhead hard enough to black out. When he came to, he was on the surface, half on a bit of wreckage, half in the water, choking up salt and oil. Someone must have dragged him into the life raft. He never knew who. Around him floated splintered hull plating, oil slicks, and a few bodies face down, turning with the swell. By dawn, only 7 men were left alive on the raft. A small Soviet patrol craft slid out of the fog and circled them. There were rifles on the rail, orders barked in Russian, rough hands hauling them aboard. Those scattered images were all it took to make something brutally clear. He was no longer part of a fighting crew. He was now a prisoner of war. The patrol boat pushed up into Kola Bay, past gray coastline and stunted forests, until it tied up at a small, anonymous pier. The 7 Germans were marched through mud and gravel to a fenced compound. A few wooden barracks, 2 guard towers, a red flag snapping sideways in the wind. On Soviet paperwork, it had a neat designation, Northern Labor Point Number 43. To the men entering through the gate, it was just a cold name that meant an unknown winter and forced labor under someone else's rules. They were registered by the camp commander, a tired-looking Soviet officer who treated them like entries in a ledger. Name, rank, branch. No hatred, no warmth, just a warning that nobody here would beat them for sport, and nobody would spare them an extra slice of bread either. From that moment on, they belonged to a system built around work quotas and rations. That first night, all 7 were crammed into the same barrack. The bunk frames were rough, the straw mattresses smelled of mold and old sweat. The stove barely pushed back the cold along the walls. Outside, the wind rattled the wire, and a dog barked now and then somewhere in the dark. Lying on the top bunk, staring into the gloom, Willy had the same thought over and over. He had been stripped of everything that used to define him. All that was left was a simple, brutal question: how to survive the coming winter. The camp showed its rhythm the very next morning. Reveille sounded before the sky was fully light. Men were pushed out into the wind, lined up, handed a thin bowl of porridge or black bread soup, and sent straight into work assignments. In the far north, the war depended as much on roads as on guns, lend-lease supplies, canned food, fuel, steel, even disassembled tanks came by convoy to the Soviet Arctic ports and had to move inland. Ironically, a survivor from the U-boat campaign now found himself maintaining the very routes his Navy had tried to cut. Willy and the other 6 were put on a snow-clearing team. Armed with shovels and picks, they trudged along a half-buried dirt road, supported by rough log shoulders and frozen solid underneath. The temperature sat around -20. The wind didn't just chill, it shoved the breath back into their faces. A Soviet sergeant oversaw the squad, noting how much ground was cleared, calling for more speed when they slowed. To him, the Germans were not special, not noble enemies, not monsters, just units of labor in a battered rear area machine. The work was numbing: scrape away loose snow, hit hard ice, chip it up, move on. Hands blistered, then split open in the cold. Blood, dirt, and ice merged into a crust on their palms. The days fell into a dull loop. Work in the half-light, a short break with a crust of bread and cold water, more work until darkness, a roll call, then the long fight with damp blankets and icy drafts at night. Danger here was different from danger at sea. On the boat, death had come from things you could not see. Sonar pings, the dull thud of a depth charge, and struck in seconds. In the camp it came slowly and stubbornly. Hunger that never really left. Cold that gnawed through layers of cloth, lungs filling with moisture that never dried. The barracks were a shelter, but not a safe one. At night men coughed until they were hoarse, toes turned blue, and some woke screaming from dreams of sinking steel and airless compartments. The stove roared and went quiet in cycles, and the crackle of burning wood blended with those human sounds into another kind of wartime noise. Willy had never been easygoing. Growing up near the docks in Hamburg, he had learned early that shouting and fists were tools. The Navy had disciplined his body but not erased his temper. The cramped, tense world of the U-boat had trained him to hold himself in check. Any outburst could jeopardize the crew. Now, back in open air yet under guard, that bottled-up anger surged back. He hated being used as a beast of burden. He felt humiliated by curt orders in a foreign tongue, and even more by watching fellow prisoners fight over scraps. One day, during bread distribution, a man tried to cut into the line. Before Willy had time to think, his hands were on the man's chest and they were grappling in the mud. It was over quickly, guards shouting, a rifle butt as punctuation, but the bruises stayed for days. Among the 7, a pattern of judgment emerged. Willy had strength and nerve, no question, but he was volatile. Older non-coms like Albert and Carl slowly realized his outbursts weren't just bad temper. He was trapped in a deeper conflict, unable to accept being downgraded from frontline sailor to camp labor, yet fully aware that any open defiance would only mean harder punishment for everyone. At night, staring at the rough planks above his head, he kept replaying the moment of the explosion, the snuffing out of light, the way the U-boat had rolled and gone under. It was hard to think of himself as just another prisoner in a crowded barrack, when his ears still rang with imaginary depth charges. By November, winter closed in for real. Daylight shrank to a few gray hours. The sky rarely showed color beyond a flat, milky white, and it was easy to lose track of time. Wind came in from the sea carrying ice grains that scraped bearskin raw. Boots stayed wet, froze stiff, then cracked. Men wrapped their feet in rags and hoped for the best. Sick lists grew longer. Frostbite, fevers, hacking coughs that turned bloody. All of it piled into a small, overworked infirmary. Supplies were thin. Serious cases were treated. Others were given spirits, bandages, or nothing at all. Here, another of the 7 became crucial. Jurgen, once a medic aboard the U-boat, was quickly pulled into the infirmary to help. He spent his days cleaning wounds, splinting limbs, listening to chests. It didn't matter if the man on the cot wore a Soviet greatcoat or a German field jacket. The symptoms were the same. Tissue going black, lungs filling, bodies worn thin by cold, and calories burned in labor. From Willie's point of view, it was a hard thing to swallow. He had been trained to see pride in sinking enemy ships. Now his comrade was literally keeping the enemy alive. It felt like the world had turned upside down. But the longer the winter went on, the harder it became to ignore a brutal truth. Out here, death did not care about uniforms. Men on both sides shivered on the same wooden planks and coughed the same red stains into rags. In early December, a new kind of alarm went through the camp meteorologists in the region, warned of a severe cold snap and a heavy blizzard heading for the Kola Peninsula. For the military authorities, this meant more than bad weather. It meant the risk of losing entire convoys and cutting off the port orders came down to push as much cargo as possible through the roads before the storm hit. Trucks ran back to back. Prisoners were driven harder, clearing snowbanks, reinforcing embankments, piling crude snow fences along exposed stretches. Then the storm arrived. The sky darkened in the middle of the afternoon. Wind rose to a howl. Snow slammed sideways, and the entire camp seemed to vibrate. Roofs creaked, wire groaned, visibility vanished. Nobody really slept that night. It was too loud and too cold, as if the whole world was being shaken in someone's hands. By the third day, the blizzard eased just enough for lookouts to see out beyond the wire. On one stretch of road, a long, unnatural rise in the snow stood out. Wrong shape, wrong texture. Records showed a supply truck should have been there the previous day. Radio calls brought no answer. The camp staff made a harsh calculation. If a truck had been buried in that storm, the 2 men in it were either already dead or very close. Yet to attempt a rescue meant sending people back into deep snow and bitter wind when many were already exhausted. Men, fuel, and time were all running low. In the end, the commander decided that doing nothing was worse. A mixed rescue team was formed. A handful of Soviet soldiers and the 7 German sailors, judged still strong enough to be useful. They were given ropes, shovels, a battered medical kit, and not much else. Each man tied himself into the line so nobody would wander off into the whiteout alone. The small column stepped out of the camp, and immediately the familiar shapes disappeared. The world shrank to boots, rope, and a blur of gray snow reached their thighs. Underneath lay ice, treacherous and uneven. Every step cost effort. Breath froze on beards and scarves, and each inhalation felt like knives in the chest. Somewhere along that march, Willie's relationship to the rope changed in his mind. It wasn't just a safety measure anymore. It felt like the last tangible thing connecting them to the living world. If it broke, someone might simply vanish into the landscape for good. After an hour or more, the wind thinned enough to reveal a long, rounded mound where the road should have been flat. The rescuers spread out, prodding with their shovels until one struck metal. A patch of dark green appeared as they cleared the snow. A truck roof, buried almost to the top. The doors were frozen shut under packed ice. It took several men wrenching and prying to open a crack. A foul, cold breath of air came out, stale with too many exhalations and no fresh oxygen. Inside, 2 men lay crumpled together, pale and rigid, but not yet gone. Their skin was waxy, their hearts barely moving, but there was still life. Jurgen worked fast, doing what little he could to protect their limbs from further damage and prepare them for transport. Then came the hardest part, getting them back. Now the rope had to bind not just rescuers, but unconscious weight. Men took turns dragging, lifting, supporting. Willie insisted on taking one of the burdened positions. The first attempt nearly drove him to his knees. The combined weight and the resistance of the snow were like a wall. He forced himself back up, feeling the slight warmth of a breathing body against his shoulders. Death, he realized, didn't always roar in with water and fire. Sometimes it seeped in quietly from every side, inch by inch, waiting for a body to stop moving. When the camp's outline finally came into view through the haze, wire, roofs, a watchtower, it felt less like reaching prison and more like reaching shore. The truck crew was rushed into the infirmary. The rescuers simply collapsed where they stood, steam rising off their clothes as sweat met freezing air. No speech was made, no official commendation circulated. Yet afterward, the small currents of camp life shifted. The 7 sailors often found an extra sliver of potato in their soup. Their names appeared a little less frequently on the list for distant road work, a little more often for tasks inside the perimeter. The glances from some guards lost a fraction of their old hostility. Inside Willie, something had shifted as well. The rescue hadn't resolved his resentment about captivity, nor erased the line between sides, but it had given him a memory he could not file under orders, alone. In the worst of the storm, for a short time, he had walked not as a tool being used, but as someone who chose to carry another human being out of the snow. Winter dragged on. Snow still fell, but the war far away was beginning to tilt toward its end. News crackled over the camp's loudspeakers: Soviet advances, collapsing German fronts, Allied troops pushing in from the west. The names of cities, Königsberg, Vienna, Berlin, floated into this Arctic pocket, stripped of their old solidity. For the prisoners, especially the Germans, the meaning was brutal and simple. Whatever waited for them back home, it would not be the country they had left. Many suspected they would return not to streets and familiar buildings, but to ruins. For Willie, this realization ate away at the identity he had clung to. He was no longer a sailor defending a distant homeland. The homeland itself was being pounded into something unrecognizable. The slogans, uniforms, and rank insignia that had once given shape to his life were becoming relics, even before he set foot outside the wire. When Germany's unconditional surrender was finally announced, the camp did not erupt. There were no celebrations, just a long, heavy silence as men absorbed the fact that the war, in a formal sense, was over. Work details were eased, forced labor stopped, yet the gates did not swing wide. The prisoners were still prisoners, pending paperwork, negotiations, and whatever political decisions came down from above. Spring in the far north came cautiously. Snow thinned, turned to slush, then to muddy ruts. Patches of moss and low plants appeared. Days' lengthened tasks now involved dismantling snow fences, repairing roofs, organizing what remained in storage. The atmosphere, while still tense, loosened a notch. The line between captor and captive softened in small ways. During shared jobs, some Soviet guards and German prisoners traded basic facts: where they came from, whether their families had survived, what they hoped to do after all this. The conversations were clumsy and short, but they were human. The men pulled from that buried truck eventually healed enough to walk. One of them, seeing the 7 sailors in the yard, recognized them and raised a hand in quiet acknowledgement. For him, the memory of that blizzard would always be tied to their silhouettes in the snow. For Willie, it marked the point where his idea of himself had begun to change. In early summer 1945, orders finally arrived to start sending men home. Prisoners were sorted by nationality and branch, then scheduled for transport toward ports and transit camps. The 7 German Navy men were kept together. They received whatever little had been held in their names at intake. A corroded watch here, a water-damaged photograph there. Willie had nothing from before the sinking. All he carried was a small fish-shaped pendant, cut from scrap metal during long winter nights. A piece of the camp itself turned into a keepsake. Before they left, the sergeant who had once driven them hard on the road crews met them at the gate with his notebook in hand. He mentioned, in his own clipped way, that the driver pulled from the snow had been sent south and was expected to see his home again. For some anonymous family, there would be one less telegram with black borders because of that rescue. It was not a medal, but it was something Willie could live with. The truck taking them out of the camp bounced along the same route they had cleared and cursed all winter. The high snow walls were gone, replaced by mud, bare rock, and low, stubborn greenery. The structures of winter had been broken up. The traces of war were still visible, but no longer the only thing the eye could see. Soon after, a ship carried them out of the Arctic. From there, a maze of transit points, interrogations, and crowded trains would eventually deposit them back into a shattered Germany under occupation and reconstruction. None of that would be recorded in the Soviet files about the camp. Years later, when those files were sorted and boxed, Northern Labor Point number 43 inches took up only a few dry lines. Numbers of prisoners, nature of their work, rough casualty figures, a note that there had been no major incidents. The blizzard, the truck, the rope, the weight on Willie's shoulders. None of that made it into the official record paper ages. Ink fades. Cabinet doors stick and are forgotten. The state's memory moves on. Willie's memory kept the Arctic winter alive in different ways. In peacetime, he might wake at night to the sound of heavy wind against a window and for a moment feel snow in his lungs again. A hand would go to his chest to touch the little metal fish, to reassure himself that he was in a room with heating and walls, not in a barrack with gaps in the planks. When people asked about his time as a prisoner, he rarely turned it into a story. He tended to say he had shoveled a lot of snow, carried a lot of timber, and been cold for a very long time. Sometimes he added that once, in a storm, he had helped carry a half-frozen man back to camp. He never called it heroism. He did not pretend he had been only a victim either. The months in the Arctic became a quiet thread running through the rest of his life. They marked the stretch where he was forced to move from raw anger and shame towards something closer to acceptance, where he had to ask who he was when uniforms, orders, and flags were stripped away. To the wider world, he remained an anonymous line in a long list of German naval prisoners repatriated summer 1945. To himself, that winter was a hinge. After it, he was no longer just a young sailor driven by fury, but a man who knew that once, in a place of ice and wire, he had chosen to carry someone else out of the snow, and who tried, in small, unremarkable ways, to live with that knowledge. The Arctic wind still sweeps across Kola Bay each year, over old ports, empty lots where camps once stood, rotting fence posts swallowed by moss. It keeps no roll call, remembers no names. It only confirms a simple, hard truth. In that winter, some died, some survived, some changed. Some were buried in the snow, and a few, like Willie Kranz, managed to walk out of it.